1979 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. AC/DC had finally cracked the code with Highway to Hell. They weren't just a bar band from Australia anymore. They were a global juggernaut. Bon Scott, the charismatic, gap-toothed poet of the gutters, was finally getting the fame he deserved. But on a freezing February night in London, in 1980, the music didn't just stop, it vanished. The image of Bon slumped in the back of a small Renault 5 is one that haunts rock history, all called night and a tragic end. When the news broke, the world didn't just mourn a singer, they mourned the soul of the band. For Angus and Malcolm Young, the grief was compounded by a terrifying question: is this it? The funeral was barely over when the pressure began. The record labels, the management, the industry, everyone wanted to know who would step into the dead man's shoes. But the young brothers weren't looking for a replacement. They were looking for a reason to continue. They spent weeks in a silent rehearsal room, barely speaking, just playing their guitars to drown out the emptiness. Then Malcolm remembered a story Bon had told them years earlier. Bon had seen a singer in a band called Geordie. Told the brothers, this guy was incredible. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, rolling on the floor, kicking and crying. It was the best performance I've ever seen. What Bon didn't know at the time was that the singer wasn't acting. He was having a massive attack of appendicitis. That singer was Brian Johnson, a working-class guy from Newcastle who had long since given up on his dreams of stardom. He was 32 years old, repairing vinyl car roofs to feed his family, and he thought his time in the spotlight was over. Little did he know, he was about to be called to lead the greatest comeback in the history of music. In early 1980, Brian Johnson was a man who had made peace with a quiet life. He was a Geordie tough, no-nonsense worker from the industrial north of England. The heights of the music charts seemed like a lifetime ago. When the phone rang and a mysterious voice invited him to London for an audition with a big band, Brian almost didn't go. He had bills to pay and car roofs to fix. But his father, a veteran of the Desert Rats in World War II, told him, "Son, you don't turn down a chance to see if you're still good enough." When Brian arrived at the rehearsal studio in London, he didn't find a group of pampered rock stars. He found the young brothers two small, intense men who looked as weathered as he did. But Brian was nervous, didn't head straight for the microphone. Instead, he saw the roadies playing pool in the corner of the room. He grabbed a cue and started playing. He wasn't trying to be cool, he was just trying to stop his hands from shaking. Angus and Malcolm watched him from across the room. They liked what they saw before he even sang a note. Here was a guy who wasn't trying to impress them, a guy who fit in with the crew better than with the suits. Finally, Malcolm called him over. "What do you want to sing, Brian?" Brian didn't hesitate, chose Whole Lotta Rosie. He knew that song wasn't just a hit, it was Bon Scott's anthem. It was a test of fire. As the band kicked into that legendary riff, Brian didn't just sing, he exploded. He channeled all the frustration of a working man, all the grit of the Newcastle shipyards, and all the soul he had left. When the song ended, there was a stunned silence. Then the band asked him to sing Nutbush City Limits. Again, he tore the roof off. But there was one final test. The young brothers handed him a few lines of a new idea they had been working on. It was dark, it was heavy, and it felt like a funeral march. Brian looked at the lyrics and sang the first lines of what would become Back in Black. At that moment, the abyss began to close. Brian wasn't trying to be Bon. He was something else entirely, a powerhouse of gravel and lightning. He left the studio thinking he'd done all right, and went back to Newcastle to wait for the bus. He didn't know that back in that room, the young brothers had already stopped looking. They had found the voice that would carry them into the fire. With a new singer in place, the band didn't head to a luxury studio in London or New York. Instead, they flew to Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas. It sounds like a vacation, but for a CDC, it was a descent into a humid, salty hell. It was April 1980, and the islands were being hammered by one of the worst tropical storm seasons in years. The studio was falling apart. The humidity was so thick it made the guitar strings rust in hours. The electricity would cut out in the middle of a perfect take. But the weather outside matched the tension inside. They were working with producer Mutt Long, a man known for a perfectionism that bordered on the insane. He didn't want a good rock record, he wanted a masterpiece that would stand for eternity. Then came the problem of the bell. For the opening track, Hell's Bells, the band wanted a sound that felt like a funeral summons from the underworld. They didn't want a sound effect from a library. They wanted a real, massive bronze bell. They tried recording the bell at a nearby church, but the birds nesting in the belfry kept ruining the takes by flying out every time the hammer hit the metal. Finally, they had a custom 2,000-pound bronze bell cast specifically for the band. But even that wasn't enough. To get that iconic, bone-chilling ring that opens the album, they had to set up a mobile recording unit in the middle of a foundry. That bell didn't just represent a song, it represented the weight of Bon Scott's passing. Every time it tolled, it was a salute to the man they had lost. Meanwhile, Brian was under a different kind of pressure. He was sitting in a room with a notebook, listening to the storms rattle the windows. He had never written lyrics for a band this big. He felt like an imposter. One afternoon, as the sky turned black and the lightning lit up the ocean, Mutt Lange walked in and said, "All right, Brian, the boys have the riff. What have you got?" Brian looked at the chaos outside, listened to the thunder, and wrote down the words, "I'm rolling thunder, pouring rain. I'm coming on like a hurricane." He wasn't just writing a song. He was capturing the atmospheric violence of the Bahamas and the emotional storm of joining the world's most dangerous rock band. The abyss was behind them. The Back in Black era had truly begun. As the album began to take shape, a whisper started in the shadows of the rock world, a whisper that has never truly gone away. If Brian Johnson had only been in the band for a few weeks, how did he write some of the greatest lyrics in the history of the genre? To this day, many old-school fans and conspiracy theorists claim that Back in Black is actually Bon Scott's final gift from beyond the grave. The legend says that Bon had a notebook filled with lyrics for the next album. Some say those notebooks were stolen from the car where he died. Others believe the Young brothers handed them to Brian to fix the songs. They point to tracks like Rock and Roll, Ain't Noise Pollution, or Have a Drink on Me, claiming the phrasing and the wit sound exactly like the man who wrote Highway to Hell. But what is the truth? Brian Johnson has spent 40 years defending his work. He describes the agonizing nights in the Bahamas, staring at a blank page, feeling the ghost of Bon Scott sitting on his shoulder. He famously said that he felt as if someone was channeling the words through him. The Young brothers have always been firm. Out of respect for Bon, they started from a completely clean slate. They didn't want to use his ghost to sell records. They wanted Brian to be his own man. While there may have been titles or ideas discussed over a beer months earlier, the grit and the Newcastle soul in the lyrics belong to Brian. Yet, the mystery is part of the album's dark magic. Whether Bon wrote the words or simply inspired them from the great beyond, his presence is felt in every line. It's why the album doesn't feel like a replacement hit. It feels like a transition. A handoff from one legend to another, ensuring that the flame Bon lit would never be extinguished by the wind. On July 25, 1980, the world finally saw it. There were no flashing lights on the cover, no photos of the band, and no colorful logos. Just a solid, deep black sleeve with the AC/DC name embossed in simple outlines. It was a funeral shroud for a friend, but inside that sleeve was the most electric, high-voltage recording the world had ever heard. The industry experts were skeptical. They thought the loss of Bon Scott was a death sentence. But then, the needle hit the groove of Hell's Bells. Then came Shoot to Thrill, and finally, the title track, Back in Black. The response wasn't just positive, it was a global explosion. The album didn't just climb the charts, it stayed there for decades. It became the definitive sound of the 1980s, eventually becoming the second best-selling album of all time, surpassed only by Michael Jackson's Thriller. For the fans, especially those who lived through that era, Back in Black was more than just a collection of hits. It was proof of resilience. It showed that even when you lose the heart of your team, you can find the strength to honor the past while building a new future. Brian Johnson didn't just survive the pressure. He became a legend in his own right, leading the band for over 4 decades with a humility and power that earned the respect of every old-school rocker on the planet. As we look back 45 years later, the impact of those 10 songs remains unmatched. From the stadiums of South America to the pubs of Newcastle, that opening riff still makes the hair on your neck stand up. It's the sound of a band that refused to die. It's the ultimate tribute to Bon Scott, a masterpiece forged in the storms of the Bahamas, and the reason why, no matter how much the music industry changes, rock and roll will never be noise pollution.